Welcome to the first annual Ashford University Research Symposium. I'm Peggy Sundstrom, a program chair in the College of Doctoral Studies, and I'm really pleased to be your host for this event. Let's start with our first presenter. Our first presentation is by Dr. Gary Clayton. Dr. Clayton is a proven professional executive with significant experience in conflicts involving business agreements, contracts, finance and property disputes, accident and injury, and family members. Gary found that very limited research existed on the effects of the relationship between mediation experience, mediation practice, and the frequency of mediation practice on the determination of mediation outcomes. So this session today presents the results of his research that provide mediators with empirical information that informs the standard of practice for optimizing mediation outcome and mediator experience and effectiveness. To those of you who are in our audience, I'll ask you to use the chat function to list any questions or comments you may have on Gary's presentation, and we'll address those at the end of this 30-minute session. So now I present to you Dr. Gary Clayton.
Okay. I want to welcome again everyone to the Ashford University Research Symposium. And I want to thank each of you for attending this presentation. And again, my name is Gary Clayton. Let's get started. The title of this presentation is Mediator Competence and Proficiency, Empirical Standards. This presentation is based on my doctoral dissertation research. The title of my dissertation was The Role of Experience in the Determination of Mediation Outcome of Mixed Method Study. I was conferred a Doctor of Psychology degree on September 10th, 2018, so this information is relatively current. Now, conflict is a competition for consideration of resources, needs, feelings, values, wants, or desires. And mediation is about resolving or managing conflict. Now, during this presentation, we're going to talk about the mediation business, or the business of mediation, if you will, mediation models, how mediation works. Antecedent conditions are the context of the mediation that affect mediation outcome. We're going to talk about competency and proficiency standards for mediators, an overall overview of the research study itself, and finally I'll present the results of the study. Now I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. This study identified mediation practice frequency as the single most significant factor indicative of mediator effectiveness. Now, for those that are new to mediation, mediation is a process whereby the disputing parties, with the assistance of a third party, typically a mediator, attempt to reach resolution regarding the outcome of their dispute. Now, mediation empowers the disputing parties to reach resolution ostensibly through their own volition and self-determination, thereby giving the disputing parties more predictable control of a dispute's outcome. Agreements reached in mediation tend to be honored more than by the parties than in litigation. Now, and mediators are third-party dispute resolution professionals that facilitate the mediation process. The mediation business. Now, disputing parties who hire or engage mediators do so with the intention of resolving their differences. Consequently, the selection of an effective mediator, or one capable of effectuating resolution, is of paramount importance to the disputing parties. What we found is that most of the top mediators practicing today have spent in excess of 5 years practicing before their mediation business started to turn a profit. During this initial practice time, these mediators developed experience, but also, and most importantly, a reputation. A mediator's good reputation is a sine qua non of success in the mediation business. And the number of paid mediation opportunities is far less than the number of voluntary and professional mediators seeking opportunities to mediate. So there are limited opportunities for mediators to practice. We've also found that in court-ordered mediation cases, the attorneys representing the parties often select a mediator based on the mediator's status, reputation, or rank from a closed list of mediators. Mediation professional is further compounded by the fact that the mediators with high rank, status, or celebrity are awarded the very few paid mediation business opportunities that become available. The mediation profession is dominated effectively by a relatively small number of mediators, making a disproportionate amount of the money paid for the mediation services. We found that most practicing mediators practice part-time and often provide service pro bono due to the inability or willingness of the conflicting parties to pay for their services. Now, these types of cases account for over 50% of all court-ordered mediation cases. And the result is that very few mediators have an opportunity to practice, gain experience, and most importantly, gain exposure and develop a reputation. Mediators are typically selected based on the popularity or reputation of the mediator as a gauge of their competence and proficiency. Now, after a lot of investigation, one thing stood out about the mediation business. There are no competence or proficiency standards for mediators. And mediators are typically selected based on the popularity or reputation of the mediator as a gauge of their competence and proficiency. Now, there are organizations that exist, like the Texas Mediators Credentialing Association, and they've gone a long way in proffering standards. However, the science behind the standards that they proffer is not very clear. I'm going to talk a little bit now about mediation models. George E.P. Box is credited with saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And most models are useful because they can abstractly systematize the world. A systems model can provide a framework for the discussion and understanding of mediation from the perspective of the mediator, the mediation participants, as well as other third parties. Now, a couple of models that were useful for this study included the system state transition model by Herman, Hollett, and Gale. We call it the HHG model. And it depicts the mediation process as a series of state transitions, each state being individually characterized by conditions or variable states. So for the HHG model, the T0 state represents antecedent conditions or variable states that exist before execution of the mediation process. These antecedent conditions include mediator attributes. For example, training, experience, time since the mediator's last mediation, and practice frequency. TM represents the mediation process execution itself and consists of variables and variable states that present the mediation is being conducted and includes variables related to procedures and social interactions. And T1 is a short-term mediation outcome, which represents conditions or variable states immediately following the conclusion of state TM. And one variable state for T1 is either an agreement or no agreement was reached. T2 is long-term mediation outcome, and it represents conditions or variable states related to the long-term outcome following T1. And this state corresponds to what we would call agreement compliance.
Leave this. I got a webinar running in the background.
Situated model mediation depicts mediation as a series of decisive interventions made by the mediator based on the situation that defines or characterizes the mediation at that moment in time. The choice of available interventions is dependent on a number of factors, including mediator experience, which also happens to be a condition antecedent to the mediation process. Now, for your information, in the situated model of mediation, a mediation is characterized using 4 primary dimensions: conflict intensity, interdependence of the parties, context of the mediation, and the overt versus covert nature of the issues and processes defining the conflict. This model basically states that appropriate mediator intervention will be determined by the situation presented by the mediation. Cyclically, each intervention performed by the mediator will alter the situation and the need for a more appropriate intervention. The interventions available to the mediator are mediator attributes, and they're based on the mediator's experience or training, which are also antecedent conditions, and they're also constrained by the context itself. But the point I want to make here is that both models depict mediator attributes as factors influencing mediation outcome. Now let's talk a little bit about antecedent conditions. Antecedent conditions for mediation help define the mediation context. So some of these antecedent conditions are mediator attributes. For example, training, experience, process knowledge, status, reputation, time since the mediator's last mediation, and practice frequency. Another is disputant characteristics. What are the beliefs of the disputants, attitudes, experience, and their expectations? Mediation context, which includes the place, the space, and any kind of constraints, time constraints or legal constraints, and then the past history of the process of conflict itself. And then conflict type and intensity, and then mediator competence. Now, regarding mediator competence, it turns out that competence is a perception of the disputing parties. And there are no agreed upon standards for mediator competence. A mediator's status influences the perception of competence, and a mediator's experience influences the perception of competence. Now let's talk about mediator competence and proficiency standards. Mediator competence and proficiency are antecedent conditions. Mediator competence is based on the perception of the disputing parties, their counsel, and their representatives. There are no agreed upon standards for mediator competence. However, most, if not all, standards that have been proposed emphasize a priori mediator attributes. A mediator's status influences the perception of competence and proficiency. A mediator's experience influences the perception of competence and proficiency. Which brings us to the actual research study. So the problem statement is this, and I'm going to read this, but the purpose of the study was to examine the relationship between part-time pro bono mediators' experience, recency of mediation practice frequency, and successful mediation outcome, and to explore the perceptions of part-time pro bono mediators regarding the relevance of mediation experience, recency of mediation practice, and mediation practice frequency with successful mediation outcome in evaluating, measuring, or contributing to their competence and proficiency. Now, I said a mouthful, but loosely, the purpose of the study was to see if experience impacted mediation outcome and mediator competence and proficiency. So why is this important? Well, mediation is not a licensed profession, and aside from general ethical guidelines regarding human services professionals, there are no professional standards in mediation practice. Lack of professional standards keeps the mediation field accessible and open to almost anyone, but also contributes to what we call the reputation effect, resulting in a winner-take-all reward structure and a disproportionate division of available mediation opportunities. There is limited peer-reviewed research that evaluates the effects or relationship of mediation experience, recency of mediation practice, and mediation practice frequency in the determination of mediation outcome. The body of quantitative and qualitative research that does exist related to this topic has focused on the experiences of non-volunteer or frequently practicing mediators. This study provides results that could be used to establish a basis for a more effective and fair evaluation and affirmation of mediator competence and proficiency, and perhaps expanding the opportunity to make a living in the mediation profession beyond the few to the many, essentially leveling the playing field here. With respect to the research design, this slide provides a graphical depiction of the research design, which was a mixed methods, concurrent, convergent triangulation design. And the study proceeded in 3 phases. There was a quantitative phase, a qualitative phase, and a consolidation phase. And the consolidation phase consisted of consolidating results not apparent from simply considering the qualitative and quantitative results alone. And these are meta-inferences were essentially a gestalt, and that they represented functional units with properties not derivable from a summation of its parts, sort of like the properties of a triangle are not obvious from considering the properties of the lines that form it. The targeted population consisted of mediators who provided pro bono mediator services through the Southern Methodist University, SMU, Mediation Clinic in Plano, Texas. In the quantitative phase, we use secondary data from pro bono mediation cases conducted through the SMU Mediation Clinic. And it consisted of, between the time period was between July 1st, 2016 through April 30th, 2018, collected 263 cases. And after eliminating incomplete or ambiguous case data sheets, we ended up with 148 cases. In the qualitative phase, used convenient sampling. We had eight pro bono mediators from the SMU Mediation Clinic were selected. And the mediator's experience included mediating or co-mediating at least 35 mediation cases. Mediators had been a volunteer mediator through the SMU Mediation Clinic between that July 1st, 2016 and April 30th, 2018, which also corresponded to the period of data collection of the quantitative phase. And because 17 to 33% of SMU's volunteer mediators were attorneys during that period, two of the mediators selected from this study were attorneys. There was one man and one woman. With respect to the demographics, there were 3 men and 5 women, and one of the participants would happen to be a full-time mediator. And now the results. What we found is this. Years of mediation practice frequency was not a reliable indicator of mediator competence and proficiency. Mediation practice frequency was the single most significant factor indicative of mediator effectiveness. Process experience and practice are the most significant factors influencing successful mediation outcome. And regarding mediator proficiency, we had quantified guidelines for mediator practice frequency. And the practice frequency was a minimum of 12 mediations annually, optimally 60 plus mediations annually. And there should be no more than 30 days between mediations for optimal performance. Mediators are less effective when mediations occur more than 90 days apart. Also, we identified 3 factors: process experience, conflict management experience, and practice experience were identified and determined to underlie the concepts of mediator competence and proficiency. And essentially, mediator competence and proficiency is about the number of mediation process cycles completed, coupled with cumulative time involved in the mediation process, resulting in conflict management experience. If you go to the next slide, this figure depicts the interactive and symbiotic nature of process experience, practice experience, and conflict management experience, and shows how they are all related. So this is a model of mediator competence and proficiency. So what? So implications for theory and research. With respect to antecedent conditions, mediation practice frequency, recency of mediation practice frequency, and successful mediation outcome, the study's findings support and are consistent with the HHG model both quantitatively and qualitatively. Findings confirm the importance of the mediation process in the determination of mediation outcome and consistent with the HHG model, as well as the findings of Arnold 2007, Wall and Dunn 2012. This study's findings also quantified and confirmed the findings of Wall 2001, suggesting that mediation practice frequency can lead to improved mediation process by facilitating exposure to mediation interventive techniques. The findings do refute Coleman's 2015 study that reported a statistically significant relationship between mediator experience measured in years and successful mediation outcome, suggesting that the role of mediator experience measured in years in the determination of successful mediation outcome remains equivocal. Implications for practice. The results of this study provide practicing mediators information that empirically informs a standard of practice for optimizing mediation outcome, competence, and proficiency for a demographic representing a large and significant population of mediators, namely mediators that are not full-time mediators that also provide pro bono mediation services. The importance of mediation process with respect to mediator competence and proficiency was empirically affirmed. Mediation service businesses and credentialing associations could benefit from the findings of this study when adopting and proffering professional mediation practice guidelines and standards. And this research provides quantified empirical support for mediator practice frequency and experience requirements for mediator competence and proficiency. And that about does it. I want to thank you for your time and attention. And I'm ready to accept questions. There's some references here, the next slide, and then that's me. So I'm ready to accept questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was an interesting presentation. I've just put a note in the chat room that if you have questions or comments for Gary, to post them there. I'm going to start you off with a question, Gary. I'd like to know how you've used the
Beg your pardon, I just lost you.
there.
Okay, you disappeared. Go ahead, say it again.
Yeah, sorry about that. I wanted to ask you how you've used the results of your study thus far. Have you been able to make some inroads in terms of influencing the Mediators Association there in Texas?
Well, I did a presentation back at the beginning of, let's see, I guess it was the beginning of March at the Texas Texas Association of Mediators. I presented this information, and I got a lot of positive feedbacks. There were a couple of organizations here in the state, county dispute resolution centers, like in South Texas and in various counties. They were very much interested in the numbers that I came up with and my findings, and they wanted to incorporate. They talked to me about incorporating some of them in their standards for mediation practice. So I'm starting to get some feedback on it. So that presentation went well for me on that.
That's great. One of the members of the audience had asked that question. In fact, she said, which professional organizations are beating down your door to get them to help you write standards? Because it seems like that's maybe the next logical step, is to actually create a set of standards. Would you agree? I agree.
And that's that's one of the problems with the profession itself, that they just don't exist yet. And so it makes it easy to get involved in mediation, but also it makes it very, very difficult to determine who is an effective or good mediator right now.
Right.
So these standards will help make that distinction.
Yeah, and that was one of our audience members' questions of unanticipated findings, and it seems as if the importance of frequency perhaps was frequency of practice was an unanticipated finding.
The importance of frequency wasn't an unanticipated finding. I mean, it made sense. Okay, what wasn't anticipated is that we have a lot of mediators here in Texas that talk about, I've been mediating for 35 years or 25 years, and my results show that the number of years you've been practicing mediation has absolutely nothing to do with your effectiveness. So the whole idea of reputation based on experience sort of goes away.